Okay, so this presentation is called Opening Acts, How Attackers Get Their Big Breaks. Essentially, it's a talk on initial vectors of compromise that we see at Mandiant. So I am Evan Pena. I'm a consultant at Mandiant. Before Mandiant, I used to be on the Marine Corps Red Team. Since I've been at Mandiant for about 2.5 years now. I do a lot of incident response, pen testing, forensics, things like that. I'm originally from Texas. I graduated UTSA, came over here, got my master's from George Mason. I've been working at Mandiant, love it, and that's pretty much the gist of me. This is Chuck.
Hi, I'm Chuck Willis, also from Mandiant. This is how I was hoping to be dressed today if things had gone better when the series was Kansas City. But such is life. So I'm here with y'all. Basically, at Mandiant, I mostly do penetration testing and application security work. I'm also a leader of the OWASP Broken Web Apps project, if you're not familiar with that. It's a VM with a bunch of web applications with security vulnerabilities. Check it out. I'm also on Twitter with my handle there if you want to follow me. Not that I tweet very much. So next slide. So just if you're not familiar with Mandiant, you're wondering who we are. Well, we're a security company that was started here in the DC area, and we've grown now to various places. We, at the beginning of this year, got acquired by FireEye, so we're now part of the overall FireEye umbrella. But we basically do incident response work and security testing and things like that. A lot of people know us from like our APT reports and stuff, so definitely check us out. And as I'll say again at the end, we're hiring, so if you're interested, check us out. So what we want to talk about today, as Evan mentioned, is really want to talk about the initial vectors of compromise we get when we do incident response work at Mandiant. A lot of times we feel like Mandiant goes out and talks about like persistence mechanisms that we see and the types of backdoors that organizations are having deployed on their network by the attackers. And so what we want to do in this presentation is really talk about kind of how they got that initial entry into the environment. So if you're thinking of this from the perspective of a defender, these are the things that you'd want to do in order to defend your network from what real bad guys are doing to organizations. If you're more of like a penetration tester or somebody like that, then this is the kind of things you would probably want to work into your penetration testing methodology, because this is what, again, real bad guys are doing. So one of the things Mandiant always prides ourselves on is the security testing we do. We try to make sure we're mimicking what the real bad guys are doing as well. And we have a slide at the end for questions and answers, but feel free to throw your hand up if you got questions at any point. We'll be happy to answer those as well. And I'm going to kick it back over to Evan.
Thanks, Chuck. So phishing, this is one like very popular initial vector compromise. Nothing new here. Everyone should know what phishing is by now. And what's cool is that we're going to have a unique case study that most people probably haven't seen. We've seen it in the wild, and it's kind of just a unique scenario that I want to bring up. So again, like I said, the most common attack vector, sometimes it's very targeted, sometimes it's very broad, and they just spam a whole bunch of users. Sometimes they do it for initiating a backdoor on the compromised victim. Sometimes they do it to steal credentials. It just depends on what the motive is behind the attacker and who the attacker is. So in this case study, the industry that was targeted was pharmaceutical, biotechnology, and law firms. You may be wondering, like, that's a pretty broad spectrum of companies or industries. So how are they related? I'll talk about that in a moment. So the first thing is the phishing email was sent to the law firm with 2 attacks. One was a malicious link that was sent to a spoofed OWA page, Outlook Web Access, and essentially was just there to steal credentials. And another was a malicious macro attached to a Word document that prompted a user to put in credentials as well, and then it would send an HTTP post request to an attacker-owned server and then log in on the server. I'll go through how that works here in a second. So here's like the spoofed OWA page. As you can see, it just looks like a normal Outlook Web Access page. A lot of people are familiar with this in the enterprise because people go to them all the time. But behind it is some PHP code that essentially will harvest the credentials between these 2 text boxes. Whenever they click on login, the action will just essentially post the data to itself and then redirect them back to the original OWA page, the actual legitimate one. So it looks like they just failed to log in. And then, and then they'll log in legitimately, but these credentials will be stored on the attacker system. So that's one way. The second way that they were doing was they mimicked the standard Outlook prompts. This is the standard one that most people are familiar with. This is the spoof one that they created within a form in a macro within a Word document. So then they would send the Word document to users. They would harvest credentials. This is kind of the code behind it. Essentially, it's the same thing as the OWA, but it's in VBA instead because it's, again, a macro. So you have two variables, user and pass. Then we'll call a function called upload post. It will pass those two variables to the function, and then it will send an HTTP post request to an attacker-owned server, harvest the credentials. Cool. So now, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to mention that I think what the attacker was trying to do in these cases is that they were taking advantage of the kind of normal annoying Windows behavior of kind of occasionally logging you out of Outlook or logging you out of OWA. And so the idea is that the attacker would click on this link, either an attachment or a link in the email, and think that, oh, it's just Outlook acting up again, and re-log in, basically, is kind of what they were trying to accomplish here. And it worked pretty well, I think, as far as they were able to get some credentials.
Yeah, quite a few credentials. And again, this is for the law firm. So what do attackers do most of the time when they harvest credentials from a particular organization? Normally they're going to try to get into the infrastructure. This is done through SSL VPNs. Maybe they try to get in through Citrix or whatever service portal they have externally in order to get into the internal network. That's generally the MO for most attackers, not this particular attacker. So this particular attacker was targeting something else. So what this attacker was doing is then they accessed Outlook Web Access. They would look for existing email threads to the pharmaceutical and biotechnology companies, and they would say, hey, you know, we're targeting these industries. We know that these clients are a particular client of that law firm. Let me search the existing email threads and see which ones have attachments. They would take those attachments, like let's say it's a PDF file or a Word document, they would weaponize the attachments, respond to all on the thread, and say, hey, look, we made some modifications to this attachment. I want you to review it. And it's coming from a legitimate law firm account. You know, it's coming from that legit mail server, and it's going to existing clients. So it looks extremely safe, and boom, like they just like compromised a bunch of biotechnology and pharmaceutical companies that way. So just kind of a unique spin on phishing. It's just not something we normally see. Normally we see them trying to compromise that particular target, but they were trying to pivot from that target to their clients. So it was a pretty big deal. So kind of how it worked, you know, you have the law firm, you know, you compromise a particular email account. You start just mass, you know, phishing from that particular account, which looks legitimate with the malicious attachment. And then the victim will then open the attachment. And then it will install a backdoor because it's a, you know, malicious attachment, it's weaponized. And then the C2 server will then communicate with that particular backdoor, compromise that particular user of that company. So how did we catch the attacker? This is what's really funny. It's because it looks so legit, and it's not, unless it like looks suspicious, which in this case it didn't. We found it another way. This lady at the law firm was complaining that she wasn't getting a particular email from one of her friends, and the email was like an article on some hack that was recent. And she's like calling IT up, like, hey, my friend's been sent me this like 10 times, and I haven't got this email. Like, what the heck is going on? And what happened was the attacker created an Outlook rule within that particular inbox that essentially said anything with the subject line of like phishing or hacked or anything like that, just automatically send it to the trash. So it was kind of funny. So like if it wasn't for this lady complaining about it, like we probably wouldn't have, we wouldn't have been called. So essentially what he was trying to do here was cover his tracks. Like he doesn't want them to like identify all their users that there's a phishing campaign going on within that law firm. So it's kind of funny, but it was a silly mistake at the same time because we caught it. So now that we find that there's a compromise for that particular law firm, we think now what do we do? So first thing that we did was look at exchange logs, but not only on the law firm, we also identified some of the victim organizations. We did an incident response against one of the victim organizations, and in the exchange log we confirmed that the particular law firm was the initial vector of compromise for that victim organization. And as you can see in the email logs, exchange logs, you got, coming from the law firm, it's going to a particular user in that particular victim organization. And you have timestamps, which is really important for incident response if you're timelining around a particular activity or event. And then you also have an attachment, so you have a file name that you can also sweep the environment for. At Mandiant, we use a lot of these pieces of evidence to perform our incident response, and this is a really nice piece of evidence just based on a particular log. So now that we had this log, we were able to go to the law firm, and we were able to look at their exchange logs to identify every victim organization that got the email, where it came from, which users got it, So then we can notify those particular victim organizations to determine what they want to do about it. But at least we did our due diligence and our duty to let them know about it. So exchange logs, really, really important. If you don't keep them, I suggest you keep them at least for 3 months, depending on your infrastructure and how much space you have. But it's definitely really important, especially if you identify activities such as this. And again, with exchange logs, you can identify every single user in your organization that got it and every single user that it was sent out to. So it's really important. Some funny facts. We have a report that's sent out called M-Trends every single year. This is just a fun fact from the M-Trends 2014. 44% of all phishing emails were IT related, and they were attempting to impersonate a targeted company's IT department. And then 93% of all phishing emails were sent on weekdays. As you can see, Wednesday is the most popular day to send a phishing email. So if any of you guys are pen testers, the attackers already did your research, you want to send a phishing email, do it on a Wednesday. Another thing is that they're IT related. So some cool scenarios is one that we've seen is you got like an IT guy, he's sending an email to a bunch of users, let's just say 25 users. And they say, hey, look, we have this new compliance check it's a browser compliance check. We have to check all your plugins and add-ons within your browser. So go to this link, it will run the plugin check, but you have to put in your credentials in order to log in. And obviously it's malicious. But the caveat is that they say, if you don't do this within 5 days, we're going to disable your account. So that automatically, people get freaked out, and they're like, oh, we have to do this compliance check, or I'm going to, my account's going to get disabled. So we see a lot of attackers do that. It's very effective because people don't like to, be unproductive. So again, IT-related, phishing emails are the most popular that we see, and usually done on Wednesdays. So how can you protect against this? Obviously, filtering technologies are really popular. Generally, these are like spam filters such as AppRiver or Postini. There's also FireEye EX, which is really, really cool. It's an appliance that's put in your infrastructure. Every single attachment or malicious link embedded in the body of a message, it will take the attachment, it will put it in a sandbox, it will automatically perform triage on it, and this is dynamic analysis on the particular binary. So it'll determine what type of activity it does. In the example that I gave earlier on the Word document, there's a malicious macro attached, inside the particular Word document that sends an HTTP post request. That's like a known bad thing. So generally, a signature is not going to be in place for that particular file, but if you're doing dynamic analysis and basic triage on the file, that sort of activity will be detected. So kind of a unique technology there. User education and reporting messages, extremely important. That's always number one, user awareness, big strategy for that. The ability to find and delete messages, going back to my exchange logs, that's really important as well. If you have the ability to identify everything that was compromised, identify file names, so you can go remediate those particular users and those systems, that's something that's very important as well. And the last thing I want to put an emphasis on is reducing the impact. So let's say, for example, a user gets compromised. How fast would it take a particular attacker to get domain admin on that particular environment? Sometimes it doesn't take long at all because they have really crappy infrastructure. And sometimes it can be very difficult in that the user does not have system level privileges on their system, so you can't dump credentials. Sometimes that particular user does not have any admin rights across any other system, or sometimes that particular user has system level access on their system, and there's like other credentials stored on the system, or they use the same local admin password against like 100 systems, so it's easy to move laterally. But if you reduce all those, these are just basic security techniques, you can reduce the impact of someone getting compromised. And that way your whole infrastructure doesn't get compromised if one guy does. So just something to keep in mind. And I'm going to pass it to Chuck to talk about known vulnerabilities.
Okay, thanks, Evan. Yeah, I was just going to mention on that previous slide, I think a lot of people get really down on user education as far as they think, users are not going to be able to learn anything. And I think that that's potentially, kind of part of the story, but it's not the whole story. I think that you need to have kind of that combination of technology and user education that, you can't put all your eggs in either one of those baskets. And, but as Evan mentioned, being able to reduce the impact is also pretty important. So, you want to do whatever you can to prevent somebody getting a phishing email and hopefully do the right thing when they get it, but then if they do the wrong thing, at least make it not so bad for your environment. So it's really a three-pronged approach, I suppose. So what we wanted to talk about next is really the other thing that we see as kind of one of the very common, most common things initial entries into networks is really just kind of known vulnerabilities. So this is not 0 days. This is not people going out and looking for custom application vulnerabilities. This is just basic stuff. I think 2014 was really a bit of an anomaly from what we've seen in previous years because we had HeartBleed and Shell Shock come out. Prior to that, there wasn't a lot of really like network accessible vulnerabilities that we were seeing in like 2012 and 2013. It was really that you would have, there was some web application, web server kind of things that you would see, but besides that, there wasn't usually a lot of network services that had any vulnerabilities on the internet. For the most part, organizations have done a pretty good job of kind of getting all that stuff off of the internet, and if it's still on there, it gets compromised at some point and then gets off of there for other reasons, I suppose. But we are seeing attackers, using some of these known vulnerabilities in various ways. So sometimes it's using just kind of publicly available exploits. I mean, even things like Metasploit we'll see. Sometimes it's more like custom exploit kits, and then other times it's actually an exploit that was more customized as far as something we haven't really seen anywhere else. So it's and the other thing we're seeing a lot of these days is drive-by downloads. So this is where, rather than being able to exploit things on the outside, you're kind of exploiting things when they're coming out from the inside. So web browsers are a very common target here where, somebody goes to some website, it'll, hit some sort of malware that'll try to exploit the client-side technologies on there or the web browser itself. Generally with those, it's difficult to target specific organizations, although we have seen some that appear to be kind of more generally targeted. For example, maybe it was a year or so ago, WTOP radio here in the DC area was compromised and was kind of serving malware. And that was probably targeted towards people within the government in general, at least, because they kind of knew that there was a lot of government and government contractors that would be visiting that website. And then from there, sometimes you'll see them pare down to more specific targets once they kind of get the initial vector. So another case study here was NBC's website was actually hosting some malware that was doing a drive-by download. Ultimately, it was hosting the RedKit exploit kit that would exploit various browser plugins and stuff depending on kind of what was available. And when you started looking into this, I think this was not a case that Mandiant worked on. I think this is something that we have kind of read about in the open press. So we can talk a little bit more specifics. That there was basically an iframe. There was the HTTP there was obfuscated just so we didn't accidentally click on this link while we were creating our slides. But other than that, I think that the URL is correct. Well, that's the iframe that we were seeing within the actual web page that was being rendered on NBC's website. And what we couldn't figure out is where it was coming from, and still we kind of dug into some of the advertising network files and that, and we found that was actually a JavaScript. So there was JavaScript that was added to the ad network that NBC was using, and that the ad then was able to then create basically an iframe that was then pulling in other content that was actually the RedKit exploit. So it's a very common thing that we see nowadays. I think you're seeing kind of those attacks moving more towards the client side because the server side is more difficult. We're also seeing this sometimes being used in conjunction with phishing attacks, where you would have a link that's sent that's not to an attachment or something like that. It's just sent to that would take you to a website that would host some malicious content. So it's kind of a combination, I suppose, of these two vectors.
One thing to add on that is, for those of you who don't know, iframe is essentially just an HTML object that renders another web page or renders something else within the web page you're on. And then lastly, if you look at the JavaScript on there, it's a document.write. Essentially, it's just JavaScript writing that particular iframe to the page. In order to do that, you have to modify the source code of that particular web page. The only way you can do that is if you do it on the server itself. So one thing that was unique is they were wondering if the attacker actually compromised the web server itself, which was hosted on the NBC snake, which was not actually the case. So they're wondering, like, well, how exactly did the attacker, put this JavaScript on the page itself? And what ended up happening was there was a third-party advertiser that hosted advertising content to the NBC's website, and the attacker actually purchased advertising space through the third-party advertiser and put malicious code within the advertisement itself, and the third-party advertiser didn't actually do their review on the code diligently, and that's how that particular malicious content was stored on the page.
Did you have a question? Yeah, the question for the recording here is just if we've seen an uptick in kind of these watering hole exploit attacks. I think it's a little bit too early this year to tell. I think like I said, HeartBleed and shell shock, I think, kind of diverted attackers towards those things. I think we're seeing some of that, but it's not. It's more targeted generally than just this. I would consider more the watering hole is where it's just you kind of are arbitrarily kind of throwing stuff out there. That sound right to you, Evan? Okay, good question though. Thank you. So everyone's heard of HeartBleed. I don't know, this slide just kind of talks about what it is, but the gist is you can use HeartBleed to just get some random memory out of an SSL server. And so this is another case study that kind of talks about how we saw attackers using this as part of one of the engagements we were working on. So one kind of caveat here is the attackers had been in this environment, and it was kind of bad timing, I suppose, on their case perhaps, that it was right about the same time that we had done the remediation event. So generally when we do an incident response, we try to figure out everything that's going on within the environment, where the attacker has different accounts that have been compromised and backdoors placed, things like that. And then we have generally over a weekend what we call a remediation weekend. And they'll kind of disconnect the customer from the internet and then try to remediate all those things at once. So change all the passwords, generally do like a worldwide password change as well, but especially on service accounts or other things that are have known to be compromised. And then also go and try to clean up all the backdoors that are known. And so in this case, the remediation weekend happened, and then like a day or so later is when HeartBleed came out. So we had just kicked the attackers out of this environment, and then they figured out like, well, okay, well, we're just going to get back in using HeartBleed. So they were going after an SSL VPN concentrator. So if you're not familiar, that's basically a VPN that's running over the SSL protocol. It's using OpenSSL, so it's using it was vulnerable to HeartBleed, and they were able to look at. Because you can kind of read arbitrary memory using HeartBleed, they were able to read session identifiers that were for this VPN. So even though they had like two-factor authentication in place, it was because they were stealing these active sessions, they were basically bypassing the whole authentication phase entirely and accessing the VPN as whatever user happened to be logged in. So that's I think kind of what this basically tells us. So they were once they were able to get the active session tokens, again bypassing the multi-factor authentication, they were then able to access the environment. So how we're able to figure this out is kind of what we go through on this next slide, and it's basically just looking at logs. So they had the organization, I think at the time the VPN vendor may not even have known that their device was vulnerable to this attack. But the organization had deployed IDS signatures looking for HeartBleed type attacks, which was good. And they also did have logs from their VPN, just looking at kind of the sessions that were there. And what they did see is a whole bunch of IDS alerts for HeartBleed attacks. So that kind of let them know that, okay, somebody's at least trying to do something here. And they saw that it was targeting specifically their VPN devices, which I think kind of led them to go, okay, well, let's go look at our VPN logs. And that's basically kind of how we were able to figure that out. I think we'll, in the next slide, we'll go into a little bit more detail of how that works.
Can anyone think as to why there were over 17,000 alerts on this? That's a lot. That's more than like an attacker would normally just, do a couple session hijacks. Like this is quite a bit in the back. Money, that's it. 64 kilobytes of memory is not that much, right? So if you have to grab it a lot in order to get like an actual, legitimate session tokens from it. Good answer in the back.
Yep, so this is kind of going through what we found in the VPN logs. So again, we had these 17,000 IDS alerts that let us know something weird was going on. And then within the VPN logs, we saw that there were multiple users that had this kind of flip-flopping behavior within their VPN sessions. So you were seeing the session kind of coming from the legitimate IP address from the user had logged in with, but then also this malicious IP address. And the timestamps kind of lined up that, okay, this was all happening within seconds of each other. Maybe if it was like a one-off, then you might be able to say, well, maybe it was somebody who was on like a network that was switching back and forth, maybe between like a Wi-Fi and a mobile network, or between different Wi-Fi networks or something. But I think also the fact that we had this one malicious IP address that was associated with multiple of these kind of weird behaviors, along with it was also associated with all these IDS alerts, was a pretty good indicator that, okay, something bad's going on. Because we also did some kind of rough geo-IP kind of stuff and saw that they were very different places. So it's not like it was the same person or some other. You could maybe argue that that you could perhaps see this type of behavior if it was like a branch office that was having weird network issues or something, but that was not the case here. And again, the timestamps all kind of matched up. So that really let us know what was going on. But the good thing, I guess, is kind of what comes on the next slide here of kind of what the impact of this was. So there was, because of this kind of flip-flopping behavior within the VPN, neither the legitimate user or the attacker were really able to get a good VPN session, because the session was kind of valid in the sense that they had a valid session token, but the responses from some of their traffic was getting sent back to the wrong location because the VPN was kind of shifting back and forth between kind of what's the source IP address that the VPN client is on. So they weren't really able to use it, at least while the legitimate users were using the session. So in some cases, I think users kind of got fed up because it was acting up, and then they just kind of walked away without logging out, in which case the attacker was then able to use the VPN connection. But in most cases, I think they were kind of frustrated with what was going on. But what we did see then is, so the attackers said, okay, well, they were only able to get kind of little bits of connectivity. They did know the environment pretty well, and there were some accounts that unfortunately were not able to be remediated during the remediation weekend. So they did have some credentials still. So once they were able to get kind of a small window of having a backdoor connection through this VPN, then they were able to go on to one of the systems that they did have access to still and try to execute a backdoor on that internal system in order to get a nice stable connection to be able to do all their badness. But fortunately for us, that the client had, as part of the remediation weekend, also implemented application whitelisting, especially on those systems that we couldn't change the passwords for. So they basically, the attacker was not able to actually execute their backdoor and do anything on that infected system. So in all, a win for the good guys. So when it comes to recommendations for this sort of attack, you really just need to understand your infrastructure and what kind of vulnerabilities might be there. I think this year has definitely been eye-opening for a lot of people. Didn't realize how many places they had OpenSSL and Bash deployed. And who knows what the next one will be like that comes up. It'll be something else entirely that we'll have to figure out where they live. And but as much as possible, kind of knowing that stuff ahead of time will definitely help you as far as when you've got to push out patches quickly or implement other safeguards. Also, being able to implement IDS signatures does help. I mean, a lot of people get down on IDS systems because they can produce a lot of alerts and it can be a lot of noise, but it can be useful in some cases, especially when you're able to do kind of data heuristics on it to see, like, this case we had 17,000 of these alerts, so I think that would have kind of stood out from your normal background of IDS alerts, hopefully. And also, again, kind of like we talked about before with other stuff, being able to have logs, I think, really helps. So in this case, we were able to identify exactly what happened because we had VPN logs. So that's definitely one of the most common kind of frustrations we have when we come in to do incident response work, is just the lack of good logging. We find that a lot of organizations either don't log stuff at all, or they don't log it for long enough, or they're not logging enough details for what we would want to really figure out what happened. And I'll pass it back over to Evan.
Thanks, Chuck. So now I'm going to talk about custom application vulnerabilities. So these are usually known vulnerabilities in internet-facing applications themselves. Sometimes you'll see a lot of custom applications that are built out there and they're internet-facing. And it's pretty common if custom applications are built, security is not always implemented in the software development lifecycle. So it's not uncommon that there's vulnerabilities associated with those applications that are internet-facing. So definitely going to talk a little bit about that, because this is a very common vector that attackers use to gain access to the backend web server itself. And depending on where that web server is placed, could lead to an entire enterprise compromise. So in this case, the victim was a financial services company. The attacker identified a vulnerability on an ASP.NET application. And just so you know, these are just URL encoded, like, URL encoded symbols, so just to kind of like tell you what they mean. %27 is a tick, and then %20 is a space, and things like that. So you can kind of follow along. So these are IIS logs. Very, very important when doing an investigation. Again, going back on log emphasis. Logging is very, very important when we do incident response investigations. With this particular log, we were able to identify SQL injection syntax within this particular page, we were able to identify a timestamp of when that happened, and we were able to identify a source IP address. These are very, very important things when doing an incident response engagement. So the first one is you can just kind of tell he just did a %27, which is a single tick. That's like usually an initial check to see if a particular parameter in a page is vulnerable. This is like very, very novel. Like this is basic stuff. When you put a tick in, sometimes you'll get the SQL syntax error back displayed to the page. Not a blind SQL injection type of response. So again, very, very common. So again, going back to custom applications, sometimes they can be terrible. In this particular case on our client, it was terrible. So he puts the single tick there. Shortly after that, I'm sure he identified it being vulnerable. He does the whole 1 = 1 to see if he can get all the data back. He did. And then he moves on to do like a particular query to get the server name. It works. And then he uses XPCMD shell, which is a stored procedure built into all Microsoft SQL databases. Everyone familiar with XPCMD shell? Good, good. Very, very important. Attackers use it all the time. It's gold. So in this particular case, he pings google.com. So why would an attacker ping google.com for this particular server? In my opinion, the reason he would do it is because he wants to see if that particular web server has internet connectivity coming back out. And the reason he would want to do that is probably because he wants to do like a reverse HTTP shell or reverse HTTPS shell, something like that. What he didn't do was pipe it to a file. So like this is not going to return anything back to the page. So I don't know what the attacker was thinking in this particular case. I left a legit log here just to show like sometimes attackers don't always have logic. So if he would have piped it out to a text file, for example, he could have just done a GET request on the text file within the web root and saw the results of that particular page. He didn't do that. Whatever, maybe he's amateur. I don't know. So yeah.
Sometimes we'll also see attackers that would like ping their own server, so some server that they control, so that way they can just look at on the server side to see if the ping comes back. But again, pinging Google isn't going to help you any because you're unless the attacker owns Google, maybe he does.
So next you'll see the attacker he's echoing a particular eval statement to a text file, which is essentially just him writing a particular shell to disk on the web root. And this is a very common web shell that we see these days. It's what we call like a China chopper. It's pretty common. So he pipes this out to a file. Now he has a web shell on the particular system, and now he can pretty much access the system. You know, he can run legit command line. He can upload files. You know, do whatever he wants. At that point, he's likely going to upload a reverse shell, then execute it, and then he's going to get a full connectivity to the web server itself. That's generally how it goes. So next, I want to just emphasize, again, putting security in the software development lifecycle. What I just showed you is nothing really new, but it's still very valid. We see huge companies all the time have custom applications, internet-facing, that still are vulnerable to basic SQL injection attacks. So it's, you know, developers have a deadline, and they're just going to try to meet that deadline as long as it works. You know, that's all they care about. They don't really care about security. And it's going to lead to something like that, which is a compromise. I want to go back to reducing the impact. Where is that web server stored? Is it stored in a DMZ? Is it stored on your enterprise network? Is it hosted by a third party? And that really does matter, and that if it's hosted by a third party and it's not tied to your enterprise, it probably won't matter that much. Maybe they can put data that's maybe part of your customer. That would be important. If it is not really important data, then maybe you can deprioritize the security of that particular application. It just depends. If it's on a DMZ that has direct ties, like, you know, very lax ACLs to your enterprise network, maybe that's going to matter. So just things to consider whenever you're, you know, hosting applications and putting data on it. Integrity checking. This is practical and not practical in some sense. So let's say you have a very static page, or you have a lot of static content that's not likely going to change that often on a web server. You know, you can probably implement integrity checking to see if the MD5 of those source files change. Someone changed it. Maybe it was legit. Maybe it was not legit. If it's not supposed to change that often, it's something that's practical. If you have a very dynamic website, it's not practical at all. And then lastly, we have penetration testing on applications. What I just showed you is, like, again, very novel, very basic stuff. Most pen testers will identify stuff like that. And then also ensuring that your internet-facing applications are maintained. And that front, it's not uncommon that these applications are built on frameworks. You'll hear things like Joomla, WordPress, you know, like tons of frameworks out there that people use. A lot of times they have plugins or or add-ons or functionality that's tied into the framework that are vulnerable sometimes, and then they'll issue patches on them. Make sure those are maintained, because it's public forum after that, and it's easy to do a quick Google dork or Google query for a particular string that most frameworks will have. If it's vulnerable to that, it's easy to identify on the internet. So very, very important. And now I'm going to talk about illegitimate, legitimate access. That's kind of funny. So this is essentially an attacker using a business partner or vendor to compromise another network. Very similar to the law firm, but slightly different in this particular case. So they'll use accounts that they got also from external forums like Pastebin, password dumps, and things like that. I'm sure a lot of you guys heard about the Adobe dump not too long ago. There was like 152 million accounts leaked. So the data that was within the Adobe leak was email addresses, a triple-desk encrypted password, and a password hint. So for you computer science people out there, it's not that difficult to tie a domain. So let's say you're looking for a domain, orange.com, and there's like 1,000 orange.com email addresses within that leak. And then you can harvest every single password that's a unique triple-desk encrypted password. So I can get all the same passwords throughout the entire leak, and then I can harvest all the password hints to each for that particular unique triple-desk encrypted password. So let's say you get 1,000 password hits for one triple-desk encrypted password. It's not going to be that difficult to guess the password. So it's like one basic way of getting the password for a particular domain. So then attackers use stuff like this to get a bunch of different passwords for email accounts associated with a particular company. And it's not uncommon that they do password use. Like, how many times is that person going to use the same password for his email, for his Adobe account, for his enterprise, like, Active Directory account? It's not uncommon. So this is just one vector attackers will use to get into environments as well. And they'll use these credentials on the external service portals, like I mentioned earlier, SSL VPNs, Citrix. If they're single factor, it's free game.
Yeah, I was going to mention on the Adobe leak, one of the things that we've got a guy who's like spent well, several months now, it seems like, just poring over that data in various ways. And one of the things that he said is that there was, I think, hundreds, if not thousands of things that were in there where the password hint basically said work password. So it was pretty clear that, if you knew where that person worked, which might have been the same as their email domain, then it was pretty easy to identify that was something that had been reused. And so I think the Adobe leak really does show that while I'm not a big fan of like draconian like password change policies, I think you need to have some sort of password expiration because it has been a couple years now, I think, from when that data was well, at least was originally from, even though it was leaked a little bit more recently. So I think that if you've got stuff that's most enterprises, hopefully their passwords have expired since then, and that hopefully they would have been forced to change it. But we do still run into some enterprises that have no password expiration, which is a bit unfortunate.
And going back to that again, just emails tied to Active Directory accounts externally, like password reuse, Citrix. If Citrix is single factor and you have legit credentials to get access to it, it's not actually that hard to break out of Citrix and get access to the back-end Citrix server. And for any of you who are pen testers out there, if you guys have ever dumped creds from a Citrix server, it's almost like a gold mine. There's a lot of existing sessions on Citrix servers from a lot of users. You can get a lot of credentials from a Citrix server itself. So again, this is external facing. It's generally tied to the internal network. You can get a lot more credentials if you break out of it. It's a very common attack vector for attackers all the time. So lastly, consider like who you're providing access. So like where is it possible to give outside system, like an outside vendor or partner, like access to the internal? Like what are your external service portals is something to identify. Identify all of those and then determine like what you can do with them. So let's say Outlook Web Access. Most people would probably think like, oh, we don't have to implement two-factor. It's just like, email. But sometimes that can contain PII, or they can use it again, like going back to the law firm, to compromise other customers or other victims within your organization. And another cool thing to mention is sometimes it could be difficult to harvest emails externally. So if you compromise one person and they get access to Outlook Web Access or their Outlook itself, they have essentially an email address like list for the entire global organization. And so then you can just go on a phishing campaign after that, and you have everyone's email. So it is actually pretty important to keep Outlook Web Access to two-factor authentication as well. And same thing with Citrix, VPNs, or any other service portal that you feel is sensitive to your organization. Okay, and then lastly, again, monitor public password dumps, because it's not, again, uncommon that attackers will use that to gain access to an environment using legitimate credentials. So what I would do personally is, let's say whenever the Adobe leak came out, I would essentially scrape that particular data for all email addresses associated with my organization, and I would reset those passwords depending on how many there are. So just something to note as well. And I'm going to pass it to Chuck to talk about other vectors.
Okay, yeah, just one last, I think, section here, and then we'll kind of wrap everything up. So the rest of this stuff is some other things that we see that are definitely less common, but we do see them occasionally. So I mean, you will see sometimes we have malicious insiders or actual physical access being used as an initial vector. Generally, those are more in like big, like multinational kind of companies. Phone-based social engineering occasionally happens, but the case study I want to talk about here is about mass malware, because so mass malware is stuff that's not targeting a specific organization. It's just generally kind of like your common banking trojans and things like that that are generally targeted more towards consumers, trying to attack individual users as opposed to enterprises. So this is again one of the examples from the M-Trends report, where we had a retail organization that ended up getting one of their systems compromised by a common banking Trojan. So the Trojan would kind of just look for, try to find people logging into Chase or logging into Bank of America, things like that. That didn't really happen here, but what the bot owner did identify is that, hey, this is actually a pretty important environment because it's a retailer, and therefore, rather than trying to exploit this myself because I don't really have that expertise, I'm gonna kind of sell access over to the cyber criminals that actually do understand that stuff. So that's definitely one of the interesting things we find in some of our incident response work when you're dealing with people in like Eastern Europe and Russia, is that they are very good bankers. They understand the banking system, and they understand how to get money out of organizations once you have access to the right people. So, but by giving access to those people, the cyber criminals are then able to do kind of their normal stuff to basically move laterally within the environment, and then ultimately targeting like the financial systems within their organization. So this is I think definitely the most common of kind of the other miscellaneous scenarios that we'll see is this kind of thing where you'll have more mass malware, but then people realize that it's more targeted and that. So to me, it always indicates it's something that it's like, you don't want to just say, well, this is mass malware, we can just ignore it entirely, because sometimes it's an indicator of either other badness to come, or sometimes it's a situation where attackers are as sophisticated as they need to be. So they may just be using very common, backdoors and Trojans and things like that, because that's all they need to use in order to get into the environment or to maintain their persistence. Okay, so just a quick summary of what we've talked about today. So if you've basically, as Evan talked about a few times, I think, defense in depth, being able to reduce admin rights on people's environment, really trying to, that's more reducing the impact of of exploitation, which is certainly something you want to do. And you'll also want to look at, logging and stuff to try to prevent, you can respond appropriately, I guess, to prevent you running into the situation where you just can't figure out what happened. But when it comes to actually, preventing the kind of things we've talked about here, I think really the middle three bullets are probably the main ones. You're just having the security in the SDLC to ensure that custom applications are dealt with properly. User awareness training for various reasons, both on the kind of password reuse and the phishing stuff. And then I think patching, patching again is one of those things that people think is going to solve all your problems, and it won't, but you do need to do it. I mean, it's definitely a common baseline of you need to make sure that you're getting patches out appropriately, and other, not just patches specifically, but also security hardening, that's done appropriately on stuff, especially that's internet exposed. So, and then just our last slide, as I mentioned before, we're hiring. Go to that URL, talk to us afterwards. And other than that, we're basically at the end of our time here. We're happy to take a couple questions now, and we're also happy to talk offline afterwards as well. So, yes, sir. Yeah, the question was asking about static code analysis as a way to prevent vulnerabilities or detect vulnerabilities in custom applications. We definitely see that happening in some cases, but I'm not sure how useful it is. Static code analysis is something that I think provides you a lot of potential flaws in an application, but it's hard to know what's the real flaws. That's been my experience with it. So we occasionally use it in conjunction with our penetration testing we do, and I think it's good as a highly automated solution. But it's unfortunately not gonna be the end all be all. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. It definitely provides some level of protection for things. Yes.
Since you guys have more exposure, what's the time from initial attack to when it's actually discovered?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, are we talking days, weeks,
Okay.
months?
Yeah, the question is just, how long is it between the initial attack and when it's discovered? I'll let Evan answer that one.
On the M-Trends 2014, I don't know how I have this memorized, but on M-Trends 2014, the average time on investigations we did at Mandiant between when it was initially compromised and when they detected it was 229 days.
So, yeah, more than 6 months.
And the longest time was like over 6 years or something like that. That was the most extreme case that we had.
Yeah, and sometimes we can't actually know when the initial vector happened, because if they don't have logs going back that far, then we can basically say it was before this period of time, but we don't know when exactly. So yeah, it's definitely unfortunate in those situations. Yes?
For the HeartBleed scenario, with flopping the API, since that was a new attack, you hadn't seen the attack that was at the environment before. You didn't know if this was any key for them. Did those source IP addresses match up to like the faculty, the active users, other than just goes around all the time?
Yeah, the question was about the HeartBleed case study and if we kind of had seen that source IP address before. I don't think that we had. I don't know, Evan, if you know the answer to that one.
So on most of them, they were not. I think it was on one, the MBI was the same from the initial compromise that we were investigating prior to. So that was one factor. And another thing was that we did attribution on the attacker prior to, whenever we were doing the initial investigation, we identified a country that it was coming from, and the same, like even the different IPs that we hadn't seen before were from that same country. So we could attribute it to the same attack group.
Any other questions? Yes.
One thing you mentioned was custom applications. One thing I've been seeing in the industry is a lot of companies requiring full dedicated browsers in order to access their applications and sites. It's becoming more and more prevalent that companies don't want to invest in their code to make sure their stuff is up to date. They want to invest in other areas. Have you seen that in the industry as well?
Yes, yeah, the question was just asking about the problems you run into with older applications that aren't well maintained, is that sometimes they require old browsers or old versions of Java, things like that, to access them. And yeah, that certainly causes problems on both sides of it. So yeah, the application itself is probably not well secured if it's out of date, but then you're also potentially opening yourselves up to client-side exploits. We definitely run into that a lot with Java. I think Java is making some improvements now where it's becoming, it's less common to have it in the browser. Most people don't use Java, even those enterprise applications aren't using Java within the browser. They're just using it on the thick client side. So I think definitely the click to run kind of policy that Oracle's put into place now is definitely better. But again, that doesn't necessarily take place if you're on more modern, if you're on an older version of Java. It doesn't happen that way by default. But I think browsers are starting to make that with the default. But yeah, unfortunately, we don't have a great solution to that one, other than you just got to kind of get on your vendors to get their stuff together. Okay, I think we're good. I think we're out of time. So, but like I said, we're happy to talk to you guys afterwards as well. So feel free to come up.